I got fired today." The words felt hollow even as I said them, weighed with a deliberate gravity I wasn't sure I could sustain. She was kneading dough at the counter, sunlight cutting through the blinds and painting stripes across her forearms. Her hands froze mid-motion. She didn't say anything immediately, but I caught the sharp hitch in her breath, the brief tension in her shoulders. That pause, that quiet, was the first crack in the armor I hadn't known I'd built. I watched her face, hunting for panic, for pity, for an answer that might give me leverage. But she only tilted her head slightly, her jaw tightening. Then she went back to the dough, as though she hadn't heard me. That silence clanged louder than any outburst could have. I needed to know the truth. I needed to test her. How much did she care? How much would she fight or crumble? The moral weight of what I was doing pressed down on me, but it was a curiosity I could no longer deny. I lingered near the doorway, letting my presence be a question rather than a comfort. Her voice finally came, flat but careful. "Did anything happen? Was it sudden?" I shook my head slowly. "Yeah. They said it's over." Just like that. She didn't ask why, didn't offer consolation. Instead, she reached for the rolling pin, pressing it against the dough with deliberate force. It was almost aggressive in its normalcy, almost like she was testing me back. The room smelled of flour and raw tension. I had expected tears, maybe shock, a frantic cascade of questions. Instead, there was control. A control that made me uneasy, because I realized the test might already be backfiring on me. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting my own unease. Then, I heard it through the gap of the slightly ajar kitchen door. A whisper. Low, almost swallowed by the morning light, but distinct. "You knew he'd say that." I froze. My eyes darted toward the hallway. The words had come from somewhere beyond the living room. Someone listening, someone close. I hadn't expected an audience. Her hand stopped again. The rolling pin hovered, suspended in her quiet. I knew immediately that my plan, the small, selfish experiment, had begun to unravel. And just like that, the weight of what I had unleashed hit me. This wasn't about a simple test anymore. The walls of the house felt narrower, and every unspoken thought in that room now had stakes I couldn't measure. The whisper came again, firmer this time, closer. "Some truths aren't meant to be revealed like this." My pulse quickened. The dough trembled under her hands. And for the first time, I wondered if I was testing her or being tested myself. I stepped closer. My words caught somewhere in my throat as I tried to assert control. But before I could speak, the whisperer cleared their throat, a sound that silenced everything else in the room. And then I heard her answer. But it wasn't for me. Part 2. Discovery and rising tension. I had never noticed how small the gaps between doors could feel like chasms. The whisper came again, this time a syllable at a time. Measured, careful, meant to be overheard but never confronted. I leaned closer, trying to triangulate the source. My wife, calm as a storm beneath the surface, continued rolling dough with precise, methodical presses, but the slight furrow in her brow betrayed the attention she was paying to someone I couldn't see. It was our neighbor, the one who had moved in a year ago. Quiet, reserved, often overlooked, a woman who rarely spoke but always observed. She stood in the hallway, almost blending into the shadows, her eyes sharp, scanning for shifts, inconsistencies, small betrayals. The kind of person everyone underestimates until the cost of ignoring them becomes clear. "She's testing you," the neighbor said, voice almost a breeze, not meant to pierce the room but impossible to ignore. I froze. My carefully crafted lie, the fired today experiment, wasn't contained. It had leaked into a web I hadn't foreseen. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't a private experiment anymore. It had become a performance under silent scrutiny. My wife finally spoke, but again, not to me. "And you let him set this up?" The neighbor's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond. Observation, not judgment, hung in her posture. But the accusation, the weight of truth I couldn't escape, was already bouncing between the two of them. I tried to intervene to reclaim the narrative. "It's nothing. Just a joke." She cut me off with a single look. Calm, controlled, yet it carried the force of a verdict. "Don't test me." The neighbor shifted. just slightly, revealing a folder clutched in her hands. My pulse spiked. That folder was out of place, but I could see the edge of a printed email, the proof of my real suspension notice, weeks old, from my job. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't considered that someone else had access to reality, to facts that could dismantle my little experiment in a heartbeat. Every heartbeat echoed in the kitchen, in the gaps between walls. I realized that my power here, my attempt to manipulate, to measure loyalty, was slipping through my fingers, and the quietest voices in the room held the greatest authority. Her next words were whispered but deliberate. "You're not just testing me. You're exposing yourself." I swallowed. My own duplicity stared back at me, reflected in two quiet observers who had seen everything. And then the neighbor leaned closer, almost imperceptibly, and muttered, "Some truths can't wait for permission." I turned to my wife. She didn't look at me, but the silence between us felt like a fissure, and in that moment I understood. The house itself had become a courtroom, and I was the defendant. I tried to speak, to reclaim some semblance of control, but my voice felt hollow in the charged air. My wife still didn't look at me. Her hands rested on the counter now, fingers lightly grazing the wood. It was a gesture almost too casual, but it was a warning I was no longer the center of this story. The neighbor remained a shadow in the doorway, silent, yet unyielding. Her presence was a kind of gravity, pulling the room into focus. Every lie I had told, every subtle manipulation, every calculated hesitation, it all reflected back at me through her calm observation. "You think this proves loyalty?" my wife finally asked, her voice low, precise. She turned toward the neighbor just long enough to acknowledge her. "You think this makes me see your devotion? Or just your recklessness?" I felt a tightening in my chest. Her words weren't just judgment, they were a scalpel, dissecting my intentions. And I realized the worst part. The truth had become a weapon I had brought to my own throat. The neighbor stepped closer. Quietly, deliberately, she placed the folder on the counter. The edges of the printed emails poked out like teeth. My heart sank. These weren't just evidence of my firing, they were evidence of the deception I had attempted, layered over weeks of carefully concealed panic. "You wanted to know," she said softly, "what loyalty looks like. You tested the wrong person." I swallowed. The quiet in the room was suffocating, each second stretching long enough to reveal my own fear. I had underestimated the observer, the quiet witness who saw through the facade. My wife's gaze fell on me finally. It was calm, but it carried a weight that no argument, no plea could shift. "You're playing a game with us," she said. "With me. With her. But the one who decides the truth isn't who you think." I realized then that the enemy wasn't external. It was my own hubris. The test, the lie, it had exposed the cracks in my character. And the quiet observer, the underestimated neighbor, was merely reflecting reality back to me. I tried to speak again, but she raised a hand, not to silence me, but to mark the space where my authority had once stood. I was no longer in control. Every word I had thought would manipulate now only deepened the fissure between us. Then I heard a soft shuffle behind me. Another detail I had overlooked. A small digital recorder, almost hidden under a stack of papers, its red light blinking quietly. I hadn't considered the stakes beyond my own moral experiment. Someone had been documenting everything I said, everything I thought I controlled. Her eyes met mine again. No anger, just clarity. "Some truths aren't announced," she said. "They are observed, they are preserved, and they will speak for themselves." I felt my chest tighten. In this room, the power dynamics had shifted completely. I was no longer the one shaping perception. I was the observed, the quiet witness, the unlikely truth-teller was the one holding the balance. And then, before I could form a question, she walked toward the door, leaving the folder, the recorder, and the unspoken verdict behind. My wife followed, her glance back almost imperceptible, but it carried everything I needed to know. I had lost the narrative. The room, once familiar, felt alien, and in that silence, the most uncomfortable truth settled in. I was entirely alone with my deceit. Part 4. Truth Under Attack. The next day, I returned to the office not fired, but suspended under a formal investigation. The email I had planted in my little test experiment had been leaked to HR, verified by the neighbor's quiet evidence. The careful architecture of my plan had collapsed under scrutiny I hadn't anticipated. I walked the halls like a ghost. Colleagues stared but said nothing. Whispers curling around corners like smoke. My reputation, my authority, had been eroded not by open confrontation but by silent witnesses who saw and recorded everything. I thought of my wife. I thought of the neighbor. Their combined gaze, steady and unflinching, had revealed the fragility of my control. Every lie I had used to measure loyalty had become the chain around my own neck. I returned home that evening to find my wife sitting at the kitchen table, the folder and recorder gone. She didn't speak. She merely gestured toward the empty chair opposite her. Her calm was deliberate, almost unbearable. I sat, and for the first time, words felt inadequate. I tried to explain the thought behind my test, but she shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly. The moral cost of my experiment had been paid, silently, but not invisibly. And yet, even as I trembled with shame, there was clarity in the room. The neighbor's shadow had disappeared from our doorway, but her evidence, the inevitability of truth, lingered like a quiet echo. "You don't need to justify yourself to me," my wife finally said. Her voice was low, a single candle in a dark room. "But you need to see what your actions cost." I understood. Not my career, not even my pride, but the fragile trust I had taken for granted. I had tried to manipulate love, loyalty, and truth as if they were levers in a machine. But real truth wasn't a lever, it was a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. The next weeks were measured in silence. I returned to work under observation, aware of every glance, every unspoken judgment. At home, conversation became deliberate, careful, weighted with understanding that nothing would ever fully reset. And in that quiet, the lesson settled deep. Power, authority, and control are fragile. They bend under observation, under integrity, under the simple inevitability of truth. Part 5. Quiet resolution with moral weight. Months later, I watched her knead bread in the same morning light. The dough, the rolling pin, the ritual, it was unchanged. But something in her hands, in the silence between movements, had shifted. I had been forced to see the subtle architecture of trust. Delicate, demanding, easily shattered. The neighbor had moved on, leaving only the memory of her quiet vigilance. No confrontation, no flourish of revelation, just the inevitability that some truths, when observed carefully, will outlive any deception. I tried to speak with her, to rebuild some bridge, but the words felt unnecessary. We had crossed a line into understanding that trust isn't proven with tests, it's preserved through honesty and witnessed in small, steady gestures. I placed my hand over hers for the briefest second. She didn't flinch. It was an acknowledgement, not a reconciliation. I understood that. Some wounds can't be erased. Later, alone, I looked at the blank wall, where sunlight stretched in stripes. The recorder, the folder, the whispering neighbor, they had vanished. But the lesson remained. Silence is not absence. Observation is not passive. Truth does not require a voice to assert itself. It needs only patience and inevitability. And as I traced the sunlight across the wall, I realized the quietest presence had been the most powerful. The one who observes without spectacle, who waits without judgment, who allows truth to unfold. I didn't speak. I only watched. And in that moment, I finally understood that the cost of speaking up or staying silent was never about the words. It was about what they reveal and what they destroy. The sun moved slowly across the room. Shadows shifted. And in their quiet passage, I felt the weight of everything I had tried to manipulate, measured, and lost. If this story made you uncomfortable, it was meant to. Because the hardest truths are the ones we overhear, not the ones we're told. If you believe silence can be louder than words, if you've ever questioned trust, power, or the cost of testing the people you love, then stay here. Subscribe for stories that don't shout, they linger. And before you leave, ask yourself one thing. If the truth was watching you quietly, what would it see?